All right, welcome to the Epigenetic Performance Series from Appear on Zoe. I'm Dr. Dan Sickler, co-founder and chief medical officer of the Appear on Zoe Corporation. And this is part of a series that we are doing for just kind of getting information out there right now. So there's a lot of people at home right now. We're in the midst of the COVID kind of lockdown, and people are looking for information. This is a great way for us to share what we've been doing and the people that we interact with on a regular basis. And today I've got the pleasure of having a friend and member of the Appear on Zoe team, Curt, with us. And Curt is a 35-year veteran of Special Forces and Intelligence community, serving as an operator for nearly 20 years in some of the most elite organizations on the planet. And I truly do mean some of the most elite organizations. I mean, this is top level stuff. Only to be recruited as an undercover operative to work alone against targets in areas denied to more conventional means. He now specializes in tailored programs for special operations and intelligence personnel who must perform at exceptionally high levels of demand. And he's also working with us to help build the Appear on Zoe ecosystem in our education and our medical programs. And what I brought him on today to talk about is complex systems, because at Appear on Zoe, everything that we do, from our medical centers to our coaching academy to the way we deliver services, we've taken a whole new approach, and that approach is a complex systems approach. But today, I want to really address how we utilize complex systems in creating optimized health. And so welcome, Curt. You ready to get started on this?
I am. Let's go.
All right. Well, you know, I know you've been doing some additional education recently in the realm of statistics, a very dry topic in my opinion, but it's very relevant when it comes to understanding complex systems. So if you could kind of give us a background of what complex systems thinking is in comparison to kind of complicated thinking, which is what we're doing mostly right now.
Sure thing, because it was a problem I had wrestled with. I think a lot of us fall into a certain manner of thinking when it comes to the complex versus complicated systems. And I think it's part of human nature, by the way, because even people who are educated on complex systems sometimes have to pull themselves out of tunnel vision to realize, wait, I need to see this bigger picture again. And medicine obviously is a good place to use in the examples. A lot of medicine these days has a algorithmic type function to it, or deductive. In other words, for folks who've worked in various fields, you might have a flow chart that shows you from step A to step B to get a desired outcome. And in a complicated system, which that works very well in, you could have something that has a finite component to it. You know, every input or every action should produce a certain reaction or result. And you can pretty much break down how things are going to work in that system. I like, for example, one of the, you used this a while back and it's a real good example too. How did we know it was an O-ring in the space shuttle accident back in 1986 that gave away? I mean, out of all of that going on with that entire system, how can they get it down that way? How do we know when an aircraft crashes, the NTSB is able to ascertain a certain rudder control went down? It's because we've engineered those systems. They're finite in nature, and through reverse engineering and problem solving, we can deductively find out what the problem is. Now contrast that to a bird falling out of the sky, dead on the ground, and we see it, we dissect it, we make a lot of assumptions, and we might say it died of heart failure or something along those lines, but we truly cannot state what it was that failed, what part in that critical linkage of events happened to cause that failure. And that's because you literally have a near infinite number of variables that affect it, much like a human. one of the things that brought complex systems to light for me is, so when we were studying the epigenetics, so I have triplets. So I've got these entities with the exact same DNA, and we feed them the same thing, the environment's the same, and yet I'm getting different outcomes. And why would that be? It's because, for all I know, one went out during a day there was high pollen and the other one was in, and that affected a histamine reaction, and it caused something different to go on in this very complex system, which is the human body. So it's external environmental factors, and then the way those types of things can react internally. And if I were looking at this, whether it's from a coach's standpoint or a medical practitioner, we have these tests we can run. We try to come to the best conclusions possible in these complex systems. But at the end of the day, even most of those are deductive. And we have to train ourselves to say, I need to look beyond these stovepipes of information and inputs and determine what other factors can come into play in a complex system.
So to kind of classify things as complex or complicated, we're talking about like aircraft, motor vehicles, computers. Those are considered complicated systems.
Correct. Yes.
And living organisms, the ecosystem, these are what we would refer to as the complex systems.
Absolutely.
So why is it important to really understand that in order to apply the correct thinking to what we're using?
Well, for me, there's two standpoints. Like, there's a mitigation standpoint when I look at it for that reason, because I may truly channel myself or get tunnel vision going down one line. If I use deductive reasoning in a complex system, I'm ignoring a lot of other factors that could come into play. Now, granted, there's to use the Stephen Covey metaphor of big rocks, take care of the big rocks first. Deductive reasoning can help somewhat with that, take care of these major issues. But if I want to optimize that system, I need to figure out what the other inputs are and how I can best affect them. And plus, there's also something basically like in medicine, acute versus chronic. And whatever the problem is, or if I'm trying to optimize, am I dealing with something short term where this one simple input, which may be a micronutrient deficiency, is in play? Or, as we have often found, well, it's not just the micronutrient, it was the sleep, the amount of movement the person's doing, their stress physiology. There's a whole lot in play there that's going to move the needle much further in terms of optimizing that system. Now,
in our current health and wellness paradigm, and this including medicine in this, what I see is that we use a lot of algorithms, and people want absolute answers. And that's not really possible because we are complex systems. We can't really apply the algorithms with a great deal of accuracy. We don't have exact answers on nearly everything. Would that be correct to assume?
That's absolutely correct. And I know there's that desire for the absolute answer. And this, from my background, it was the same case. You're dealing with, just think of interpersonal relationships. I mean, even that has a level of complexity. You go to the marriage counselor, for example. He can't have a rote playbook on how he deals with each couple. There's not going to be an absolute answer there. You're going to do the best that you can with the information on hand. It's much like the state of science or medicine today. You're trying to work towards the best answers with the current information on hand. So obviously, and data is big with us. That's why we use a lot of wearable devices and a lot of other inputs apart from blood testing and things of that nature to come to the best reasonable course of action. I wouldn't say answer, but it's a course of action. And a lot of this is a big experiment. In terms of many of the things that we try, we look at the data in front of us, we take into account what the person's lifestyle is, and then we go with it. And then we get feedback on that and we adjust further. And we're not static creatures. And that also adds to the complexity, by the way. No matter how many inputs you have, what was true today may not be true 3 months from now.
Yeah, the human system, we've always said, is not only dynamic, but it's also adaptive. So you may have a response to the exact same inputs at a different time point than you would have at one time point, because the system has adapted in some way. And I just had a consultation yesterday with someone who he has some unusual neurologic disorders, and he asked me, he said, "What's been your success with people that have presented with these kind of issues?" And I said, "You know what? If I would answer that question and tell you a certain probability, it would be a guess, and it really is. It would be me trying to sell you on something if I did." Because every human system is different. Why you have this versus why someone else has this, or what are all the pieces that play into the cause of this, are never going to be the same. It's just not going to happen. So we really try to get away from anything that is dogmatic. And I know, to use your quote, what dogmas for dorks, I think was, I love that, because Steve Jobs basically said, when we apply dogma, we're just regurgitating someone else's ideas. And I'm paraphrasing that, but dogma and cognitive bias, or cognitive dissonance is really a huge impact on our society. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a big one. That's one of the areas that interests me, because I'm observing a lot of the effects, writ large in society, and in the current issue with the COVID piece, the effects it's having on people out there. And you speak of that, both dogma and cognitive bias. And I'll throw in another one, which is what's called the appeal to authority fallacy. And a lot of people will put more weight in these particular info streams they go into, which will then feed in to those other biases, such as cognitive bias. If someone subscribes to perhaps a certain school of thought, whatever that may be, let's say they only follow traditional Chinese medicine and herbology, versus someone else who is very much in an algorithm, acute centric model, is looking for particular medicines and a particular way to take these things, not understanding the complexity, and not to mention the uncertainty of the situation, because we don't know as much as we'd like to about the virus in question. They're going to start gravitating towards these things. And what they're going to do, once again, it goes into that tunnel vision effect, and they start locking themselves into that. And that can happen naturally with anybody, with the best of intentions. But the problem is when it happens to the extent that you start excluding potentially valuable information outside of that would actually help you. It's okay to recognize my line of reasoning was wrong here. But if you're dogmatic in your thinking, you're usually not even open to it to begin with.
Well, that kind of brings us into talking about current research. I mean, as you and I know, we can generally find a research study that supports any of our cognitive biases, for sure. And most research studies are done at a population level, where they have a large quantity of people, and they come up with statistical certainties on this, and then they put that out there. So everybody makes an assumption when these are put out there like that this is a 100% or a full cover of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, that's where a lot of, and we both know this, I think the area we see this the most obviously is in the realm of nutritional science, especially in terms of that then resulting into the dogma and really reinforcing the bias of certain individuals who they actually want to follow a certain pathway. And it's unfortunate because, and yeah, as you said, I went down this rabbit hole of statistics and doing some clinical research analysis classes, because I really wanted to make sure I was clear on it and not actually succumbing to my own biases. And so it's been an evolution. So as you know, also when people are reading these things, they're not actually reading the studies many times. They're reading a medical article that's referring to the study. And oftentimes you will find that the headline in the medical article, and it's usually in what would be considered perhaps well-respected publications, whether using MedPage or something like that, that regurgitates these pieces, but even the title of the article will not represent the actual study title. And of course, it will only give an overview of what was contained in the study. And often, as I like very explicit counter arguments or perhaps contrarian views, which often, legitimate researchers will put in there. They'll say this is not causative, correlative. They use all the particular keywords, and they'll actually mention particular shortcomings in their study. And that's important for people to know so they can internalize that and realize, okay, the article made it seem that if I take this, that, it's going to cut my cholesterol level and I'm good to go, when that's not what was actually portrayed. And then, as we both know, there is a difference between types of studies, observational versus true interventional studies. And, it's a lot for a regular person who isn't doing this as their full-time job to really get into. But it's something I believe everybody should be aware of, because this can affect you in economics, regular everyday life, when you see perhaps a sociological study on violence or something like that. All the same methods are in play at the end of the day, and you need to know how to vet that information to a certain extent.
Yeah, and Mike and I have been talking about really from this complex system standpoint. We look at everything, every input that is created for our system has a plus and a minus. Okay. Every one of them. I mean, there is not one that is 100%, okay, this is positive.
Right.
So what we do is we try to look at what is the plus, what is the minus, and what is the balance of the outcome with that. Are we leaning more towards the positive side or more towards the negative side? One of the classic examples is the use of metformin. I mean, metformin is classically known as one of the best interventions for longevity. And yet you've seen recent articles that come out that say, oh, well, it creates toxicity to mitochondria, as an isolated study where they said, okay, we looked just at the mitochondria and this is what we saw. Or we looked at muscle development in elderly people, and we found that it impaired muscle development. And so people will take those isolated studies and say, oh, this means we shouldn't take it.
Right.
This is bad because it's toxic to the mitochondria. But they're not looking at the net effect in the system, which is an overall positive.
Right.
And, that's one of the things I've really taken away from learning to shift my brain into that complexity thinking. I mean, you and I have been going back and forth over some of these treatments with COVID, with the COVID-19 right now. And really taking that approach of understanding the mechanism of action of this virus. How is it working? How is it creating the pathology that it's creating? And what are potential interventions, not a single intervention, but potential groupings of interventions that can help with that. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of those?
Well, so kind of key off your mention of metformin, that example. And so with COVID, the current talk about the antimalarial medication that might be, was it chloroquine?
Yeah, Plaquenil, chloroquine. Yeah.
So I'm in another group, and it's primarily military oriented. And when that came out, there was a lot of consternation, because in the military, there's actual chronic use of these particular antimalarials, which has caused considerable problems to the point where some communities actually stopped using them. And it's primarily, and when I say chronic, I mean, because these people are deploying so much to the areas where malaria is prevalent, they're taking this stuff each time during deployment. And it's prophylactically taken during the deployments. And they saw this and they're like, wait a minute, wasn't this stuff dangerous? And it goes back to that point of view, much like metformin. Well, no, what we're talking about here is a very acute particular application of this that might possibly be very useful. So you have to take that other context in which you're familiar with and just put that to the side. And I look at the metformin situation much the same too, because now we know that you can, even if we extrapolated the study on metformin to say, okay, well, I believe this could be true in a more global sense and its effect on the human body. Well, we know that just timing the intake of it can change it. You can still work out hard and be a peak performer and still use the metformin. Right. There are things you can do with that. So it requires a definite mindset shift and That's why I said it's pretty hard, because I think we're all subject to falling into that mindset. I actually use certain cues to make sure I'm pulling back from a problem and not going too deep on the tunnel vision when I feel like I've really got it and I've nailed it, because invariably something like that will come up and I'll realize, wait a minute, I've completely excluded these inputs over here that I know are going to factor in, and I have to come out and look at it that way. And of course, there's less of a feel good than I had before, because I realized it's complex and I'm not going to get the definitive answer, which then goes back to your pluses and minuses. I call it my upside downside equation when I look at these things.
Well, I was looking at some of the responses we got the other night from a webinar we did on really boosting the immune system, and we were talking a lot about lifestyle factors. And we had one irritated observer that was commenting that they expected more from Apeiron because there was not enough science. And it hit me that people don't realize that lifestyle factors such as sleep and stress and movement, all of this stuff is science-based recommendations. They're waiting for us to bring in the peptides or the medications to say, okay, this is what you need to do. And I think we as a society are so programmed now to look for that one thing that is going to create the outcome. But you and I both know our best defense at any time in our lifetime from something like this is our healthy immune system. So we're not taking a drug or a peptide or anything on an ongoing basis to keep our immune system healthy.
Everybody wants the sexy stuff. I'm in a position now, because of the folks that I do work with, that I can pick and choose who I'm going to work with. And one of my non-negotiables out of all those lifestyle factors is sleep. And that's from my own personal experience. I mean, just you told the folks my background, a lot of injuries and a lot of sleep disruption, circadian disruption were a result of that. And going down that biohacker route, I was looking at a lot of tweaks and things to do, but it was not until the sleep component came into play that I start really seeing some huge dividends. And invariably, if I have someone whose sleep is off kilter in some way, if I can convince them to get that regulated, it's as if every other input I put into the equation just is magnified. And it doesn't matter whether it's peptides or literally just getting them to move, but that sleep component is so huge.
Yeah, I want to go a little bit deeper into some of the, I guess what I should say is shifts that we make based on situational aspects. So like right now, I'm disrupting a lot of my medical clients in their routine because of the COVID-19 risk. I had to send out an email that recommended that they stop doing their NAD supplementation, whether the patch or the one person said they were getting ready to go for an IV NAD. I was like, no, don't do that, because what we've looked at is mechanisms.
Correct.
What is the mechanism by which this virus works? And with NAD, what happens is the body relies on CD38 to come in and actually deprive cells of NAD that are infected with viruses.
Right.
And when you supplement that NAD, which is good in a healthy state, but when you're in this certain situation where your environment has changed, that is no longer good. You see the same thing with like berberine. And even curcumin right now. Curcumin, everybody's thinking, I got to take curcumin. It reduces inflammation, all of this. But we also know a mechanism that curcumin upregulates expression of the ACE2 receptors, which is what the virus is attaching to.
Right.
So do you want to upregulate expression of the messenger RNA that creates more receptors for the virus? I would say not. So I wouldn't take curcumin right now. On ongoing basis, when you're healthy and not in an environment where that's a possibility, it's true. You want to take it.
Yeah.
But in this situation, it's detrimental. One of the things you and I were communicating back and forth about is nicotine.
Yeah.
And okay, so we have an input. What happens with nicotine?
Well, that was actually going to. I was actually going to come back to you because I was thinking about that at the time, especially when I saw the NAD piece, and I'd seen that you had mentioned some other products. Because I tend to look at that input, for example, the NAD plus, and putting it in the system the way these folks were wanting to do. It's a pathway issue. I tend to go back and look, okay, how can I support my pathways, but perhaps not adulterate it at an endpoint that could cause problems? And that was where I was going to ask you actually about the nicotine piece. It's much like the N-acetylcysteine versus taking glutathione all the time. Take N-acetylcysteine so you can support the pathway. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that, quite frankly, because I like to use nicotine as more of a nootropic aid myself.
Yeah, I mean, and we do know nicotine is a good nootropic, but it also is the mechanism of the input is important. What we were debating about, or really kind of discussing to try to get to an answer, Curt and I were communicating over an article that showed that nicotine reduced messenger RNA expression of ACE2 receptors. And so that theoretically should reduce the risk of getting infected with the virus. There's less receptors available in order to create that. And we don't know the answer. We look at the mechanism and we say the probability is that this may help. Now, if you're smoking, okay, there's that delivery mechanism of the nicotine, you're damaging the lungs. You're reducing the amount of surfactant that's being secreted in the lungs. So that net effect is going to be absolutely negative. Right. Nicotine gum, nicotine patches, perhaps probability wise, based on mechanisms, looking at the whole system, may be beneficial in blocking the ability of the virus to infect the cells. Yeah. An interesting treatment that they're using is tadalafil, which is the generic form of Cialis, the generic name of Cialis. And I called it in for a client the other day who was a female, and the pharmacist was like, "You can't prescribe that to a female." I'm like, "I'm not prescribing it for erectile dysfunction or anything like that. Its mechanism of action works in the nitric oxide system." Right. To really boost the ability to treat the potential infection with the COVID-19. So, that's the mindset though. People think, oh, Cialis, it's because you've got erectile dysfunction. Yeah. And yet they're not looking at mechanisms of action with this stuff.
Much like the metformin example before, primarily for the diabetic use. And now we know about the AMPK pathways and the other issues that can be affected with that one. And it's interesting you say that because a lot of prior medications created for prior use are now being looked in the COVID-19 case. They're re-looking at those because realizing there are other pathways affected. And so the antimalarial obviously has nothing to do with COVID, but because of the mechanism in play, they're finding that this could be useful. And once again, it's a case-dependent situation. After you had brought up the nicotine piece, so I was looking at that. I'm like, okay, for somebody who's not nicotine naive, who's been using it and whose stress physiology is accustomed to it, got it, especially if this is a good pathway to use. But I was wondering, because I don't know what the duration would be of using.
That's the question. Does the system adapt over
time? I'm thinking something stress
physiology. Nicotine regularly, are you going to negate the positive effect of the downregulation of ACE2 in order to compensate the body to compensate? Right. And that's an answer we don't have. So we take our best probability answers on all of this. And this is the beauty of the complex system thinking, is that everything needs to focus on what is the probability, what will work, what will not work. It's a beautiful system. And the key to utilizing complex systems in health and general thriving is data.
Yeah.
I mean, the more data we have, the more data points we can gather, the more probability, the higher degree of probability we're going to achieve.
Right.
And I'm not talking about single data points. I'm talking about the dynamic of this data coming in over time and assessing the changes, the dynamics of that data as it changes based on those inputs. And, you know, the one thing you and I have talked about a lot is really trying to get people to get away from their prejudices about different things. I mean, you have the allopathic doctors who will downplay Chinese medicine or herbal treatments, and you have the naturopaths that will say you absolutely shouldn't do vaccines or prescription medications. You know, I joked with somebody that they said they didn't want to do any prescription medication, and I said, well, would you be okay using like a derivative of the French lilac? And they're like, yeah, I would absolutely do that. And I said, well, that's metformin. Yeah. So we have such a bias when it comes to how things are classified, instead of looking at them as an input from a non-prejudicial standpoint.
Yeah, well, a lot of it's language, and this goes back again because, you know, I've been on this educational path. So to speak to the herbology piece and the plant, you know, I actually took that class on plant pharmacology last year, just to understand the viewpoints, and not to mention if I'm speaking to allopathic doctor or someone who is more along the herbalist or naturopath range, to figure that out, because a lot of them are set in their particular stovepipe and that example you use is a great one, because you can use it with either one of those. You know, some will know, but there are some others that they don't know about, and you can always point to. So at the same time, we're talking about just basically a gradation of the same thing, and whether it's a standardized extract or are you using it in a raw form. And that, once again, getting back to the complex piece, this does not come natural to people. Mm-hmm. And like I said, from even myself, I'm constantly having to go back and look at my thinking, especially in doing my own protocols for myself, not just other people, but for myself. And I have just instilled it as a system now to constantly go back in, do a check-in. And it's much like lawyers go back and learn to debate the other side's argument and know it better than them. I try to take that mindset when I'm looking at these things, to just make sure that I am looking at that upside downside piece correctly.
Yeah, at our last live event, we had we picked somebody who was a paleo diet proponent and a person who was a vegetarian, and we brought them up to the front of the room, and we had them take the other's viewpoint and have a discussion. And it was so funny to watch, because you saw all of the biases that were so strongly embedded in each, that the other group perceived from the other.
Yeah, it's painful. It's painful to try and do it when you're so ingrained into that.
Now, you were telling me about a book that that you got recently that you're really finding valuable in this regard.
Okay, so the book, Upstream by Dan Heath, you know, how to solve problems before they become problems. I mean, as soon as I got into it, I realized, okay, this guy, what a timely gem. Too bad it didn't come out a few months before COVID. Perhaps it would have influenced some people's thinking. Yeah. But it dovetails in nicely. He uses several examples within the book. I think if we had consulted with him prior to writing, we could have found some that were even more relevant. He probably wasn't thinking about systems and complex systems when he wrote this. He was just looking at this as a way to solve problems, but it incorporates complex systems thinking.
Would you recommend this one first over like Anti-Fragile or Black Swan with Nassim Taleb?
It's a much easier read than those two, but I only realized the value of it because I did read Anti-Fragile first and read, you know, a lot of the Taleb's work first to understand the complex systems theory. But it dovetails in nicely. If someone wants, I would have no problem with anyone reading this first, just because it does offer a framework for thinking. It will definitely get you there, and then they can go dip their toe in the water with the other stuff. Because, you know, while Anti-Fragile and those others do use examples, I find some people, unless they really want to learn it, they can have a hard time with that.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, definitely worth it. It's a book I'm going to start incorporating some of his techniques further into my own framework.
I'm anxious to dive into it. It seems like a pretty on target book.
Well, I think what you'll like about it is it's much like you use many metaphors when you're trying to communicate this to people, like the aircraft, for example, or the difference between a robot and a human, you know, the complicated versus complex. This book uses a lot of great metaphors and analogies. Most of them are more of a social type, though, to get ahead of social problems and dynamics. But it is ripe for using examples in the medical continuum or with optimization, lifestyle factors. You're going to have a lot of good stuff to work with.
Excellent. All right. Well, I want to honor your time today. I know you've got some government stuff that you're deep into with this COVID stuff right now, and I appreciate you taking the time to come on and share your brain with us.
Right on. Thanks a lot.
All right. Take care.
I'll see you.